She hadn't spoken a single word since the day her father, Officer Daniel Blake, never came home. For 3 long years, little Ellie Blake lived in a world of silence, clutching his old badge, sleeping by the door, waiting. Doctors called it trauma. Teachers called it selective mutism. But her grandmother, she just called it heartbreak. Then, one stormy morning at a dusty county auction, a battered golden retriever named Beacon, scared, shaking unwanted, was dragged out into the open. The crowd pulled back. Dangerous, they whispered, untrainable. But Ellie, she stepped forward and did something no one saw coming. What happened next would leave even the judge in tears. Because when a silent girl gave a silent dog a signal from the heart, he listened, he obeyed, and the heavens answered. This is not just a story about a dog, it's a story about grace, about second chances, and about how sometimes miracles speak in silence. Winter came early to Pine Brook, a small mountain town tucked in the foothills of northern Colorado. The wind carried a sharpness that scraped across the skin, and the trees, bare and brittle, lined the horizon like weary sentinels. At the edge of town stood the Pine Brook County Rescue Shelter, a squat gray building with a peeling roof and the look of something that had weathered too many storms. Inside the shelter echoed with the chaotic sounds of dozens of dogs barking, pacing, whining. The only quiet space was the enclosure farthest from the entrance. Double-padded walls, steel-reinforced door. The sign outside read in thick red letters, "Caution, do not approach. Aggressive." Behind that door was Beacon. Beacon was a 7-year-old golden retriever. Though most wouldn't have guessed it at first glance, his coat, once likely a shining wheat gold, had dulled and tangled. His eyes were a shade too dark, holding the weight of something no one could quite name. A long scar trailed from his front left leg to his belly, a silent record of past violence. He moved with the awareness of a creature that expected pain and was prepared to return it. Over the past 9 months, Beacon had bitten 2 volunteers, destroyed 4 enclosures, and once gnawed through a chain-link gate. He didn't bark or growl to warn, he simply acted. The staff didn't understand him, and by now most had stopped trying. Some said he'd been a police dog. Others whispered about a traumatic past with a former owner no one could trace. What was certain was this Beacon trusted no one. He tolerated no one. Until the day Ellie walked in, Ellie Barrett was 6 years old. Small for her age, she had light brown hair, often pulled into uneven pigtails by her mother, and eyes like deep wells, wide and watchful. She hadn't spoken a word since the fire that took her father. Since that day, nearly a year ago, Ellie had lived inside herself, somewhere far away. Therapists had failed. School had become a blur of confused glances and silence. Her mother, June, had tried everything, and when someone at church mentioned animal therapy, she decided to try that too. Not out of hope. Hope had been spent long ago, but out of exhaustion. That day, June brought Ellie to the Pine Brook shelter. Marlene, the head caretaker at the shelter, a woman in her late 50s with cropped gray hair and a tired gait, was giving another tour when she spotted June and Ellie standing near the front desk. "We don't usually bring kids in, especially not near him," Marlene said cautiously, motioning toward the back kennels. June, clutching Ellie's tiny gloved hand, responded gently, "We're not looking to adopt, just visiting Ellie. She doesn't speak. Someone suggested we try this." Marlene sighed. "All right, but keep her close, and definitely not near Beacon." They started walking past the kennels. Ellie barely reacted to the dogs, barking, jumping, wagging tails. Her face remained calm, unreadable. Then, just as they passed the corridor that led to Beacon's isolation unit, she stopped. Her head turned. Beacon was standing at the gate of his pen, silent, watching. Ellie didn't flinch. She stepped closer. Her small boots clicked gently against the concrete floor. Marlene caught sight of where Ellie was headed and rushed forward. "No, sweetheart. Not that one, he's not safe." But Ellie had already stopped in front of the gate. Beacon didn't move. He didn't snarl. Didn't launch himself at the bars. His gaze locked on Ellie's, and for a moment something passed between them. Not recognition, not affection. Just stillness. Marlene expected the worst. Her hand hovered at her radio, ready to call for help. But Beacon didn't lunge, didn't twitch. He stood there, watching, breathing slowly, and Ellie, still wordless, still expressionless, stood the same way. It lasted only a minute, maybe less. Then June gently pulled Ellie back. "Let's go, baby," she whispered. As they walked away, Beacon lowered his head, but not in anger. In thought, Marlene watched from a distance, heart pounding. That shouldn't have happened," she muttered. Beacon had never let anyone that close without incident. Not until her. The morning sun struggled to pierce through the veil of mist that blanketed Sycamore Ridge. It was early spring, and a damp chill hung in the air, wrapping around the Willow Haven Rescue Center like an old quilt soaked in memory. The pens were quiet, save for the occasional rattle of metal or the distant cry of a restless dog. But near the back, in the shelter's most isolated enclosure, Beacon lay still, his massive golden body curled like a question mark at the corner of his cage. Rachel Hayes stood outside the gate holding her daughter's hand. She had not meant to bring Ellie back so soon. After yesterday's moment, the brief, astonishing calm when Beacon didn't lash out, Rachel had wrestled with 1,000 doubts. Was it a fluke? A coincidence? Or was there something deeper, something unspoken between the broken dog and her silent daughter? Ellie clutched a thin sheet of paper in her hand, slightly crumpled from how tightly she'd held it during the car ride. Her other hand remained tucked in the pocket of her faded red coat. The morning breeze teased strands of her light blonde hair into her eyes, but she made no move to brush them away. She was focused, eyes locked on the chain-link gate, as if waiting for something she already knew would happen. Rachel knelt beside her. "Sweetie, are you sure you want to do this?" Her voice was low, cautious. Ellie gave no response. Instead, she stepped forward and held out the drawing. A simple sketch, rough around the edges, but unmistakable Beacon, standing tall beneath a tree. The word "brave dog" scrawled above him in uneven print. Rachel slowly opened the gate. Her every muscle tensed. Beacon lifted his head, ears flicking toward them. His eyes, alert but not hostile, settled on the child. Ellie walked forward alone, paper in hand, her boots crunching softly on the gravel. She stopped a safe distance away and gently laid the drawing on the ground before backing up and sitting cross-legged just a few feet from the fence. For a moment, nothing moved. Then Beacon stood, Rachel's breath caught. The dog stretched his powerful limbs, unfurling like a great machine, waking from slumber. Slowly, deliberately, he padded toward the paper. He sniffed it once, then again. Then, without warning, he lay down beside it, head resting on his paws, eyes half closed as though the sketch carried a weight. He recognized. Rachel stared in disbelief. It was happening again, and this time, it wasn't fleeting. Ellie reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small square blanket, the one she used to keep in her father's truck, the one with stars stitched into the corners. She folded it neatly and placed it through the fence, sliding it gently toward Beacon. He didn't react at first. Then, as the cloth touched the edge of his paw, he shifted. His nose dipped. He sniffed, then nudged the fabric slightly with his snout until it was beneath his chest. With a low exhale, he lay still again, the blanket cradled beneath him like a shield. Rachel watched it all unfold in silence, afraid that even her breath might shatter this fragile thread of connection. Minutes passed. Ellie began drawing again, this time on the concrete with a stub of blue chalk she'd found in her coat. She sketched another beacon, this one curled beside a girl beneath a cloud-specked sky. Her lines were slow, thoughtful. Beacon's tail thumped once against the ground. Rachel, now crouched near the gate, whispered, "I don't know what this is, but thank you." The words weren't directed at anyone in particular. Perhaps to the dog, perhaps to something bigger. The air felt different, not warmer, but softer, a gentler kind of cold that didn't bite. By late morning, Ellie was back at the same spot, chalk dust on her jeans, her fingers smudged with color. Beacon hadn't moved far. Occasionally, he would lift his head when a sound echoed from another part of the shelter, but he never barked, never growled. Rachel sat on the gravel beside her daughter, not pressing, not pushing. Just there. Ellie looked up at her once, eyes wide and quiet. "It's sad," she whispered. Rachel froze. It was the first time her daughter had spoken in months, and though the words were simple, they struck like thunder in her chest. "I know, baby," Rachel said, voice thick. "It is." Ellie turned her eyes back to Beacon. "But he's brave." Rachel nodded slowly, tears building at the corners of her eyes. She reached out and gently squeezed Ellie's shoulder, but the little girl was already lost in her drawings again. Morning, in the outskirts of Oak Ridge, Oregon, arrived slowly and softly. The sky hung heavy with low clouds, gray and solemn, like wool soaked in mist. The shelter grounds, damp from the overnight drizzle, carried the earthy scent of pine and rain-soaked gravel. Rachel Hayes stood under the edge of the overhang near the main kennel building, one hand shielding her brow, the other resting protectively on Ellie's shoulder. The little girl wore a quilted pink jacket that seemed too large for her slight frame, her pigtails slightly lopsided from a rushed morning. She clutched a folded piece of construction paper. Another drawing, another silent gift. Beacon, the golden retriever once feared and labeled unapproachable, now lay behind the chain-link fence of his enclosure, his honey-colored coat dappled with faint mud smudges and burrs. His ears perked the moment he saw Ellie. A stillness came over him that startled even Rachel. It had become a quiet ritual now. Ellie visiting him each morning, sketchbook or colored pencil in hand, offering images instead of words. This morning, the drawing was of a large sun above two figures. One a dog with a bold mane, the other a stick-figured child with a yellow heart. Standing nearby, a new figure observed with quiet intensity. Dr. Clara Whitmore had arrived early at the shelter that day, drawn by the unusual reports. She was in her early 70s with a firm but gentle demeanor, wrapped in a brown wool coat that fell just below her knees. Her graying curls were pinned in a no-nonsense bun, and wire-rimmed glasses balanced perfectly on a thin, straight nose. Clara had worked with military service dogs for over 3 decades and was once a lead behaviorist for the National Veterinary Trauma Response Unit. Retirement had never suited her restless mind. What caught Clara's attention now wasn't Beacon's calmness. It was his focus. "He's tracking her," she murmured, jotting into a small leather-bound notebook she always kept tucked under her elbow. Not passively observing. Engaged responsive. That's different. Rachel turned to the older woman, slightly startled. "You must be Dr. Whitmore." Clara offered a warm, restrained smile. "Please, Clara is fine. You must be Ellie's mother. May I ask, how long has she been interacting with the dog?" Rachel sighed softly, watching Ellie press her palm to the metal fence, Beacon mirroring her from the other side. "Since last week. At first, I didn't think much of it, until he stopped growling." Clara approached slowly, not to disturb the moment her movements were practiced, deliberate the way one walks near a sleeping bear or a wounded soul. "Your daughter," she said, "may have unlocked something in him. Inside the enclosure, Beacon took a step closer to Ellie's hand and exhaled sharply through his nose. It wasn't quite a sigh, more like a letting go. That afternoon, Clara sat with Rachel in the modest staff lounge, the sound of distant barking forming a low background chorus. Over a warm mug of black tea, she explained her theory. These dogs, especially ones like Beacon, who served in combat or in intense service environments, they experience trauma like we do, but their recovery, it rarely follows the same path. Traditional methods often fail because they're human-designed, not animal-driven. Rachel, still skeptical but increasingly hopeful, crossed her arms. So, what's Ellie doing that the rest of us can't, she isn't doing? Clara replied. She's being... That answer lingered in Rachel's thoughts long after Clara left for the day. That night, Rachel tucked Ellie into bed beneath a patchwork blanket dotted with faded stars. She brushed a strand of hair from the girl's cheek. "You're doing something really special." "You know," she whispered. Ellie didn't respond. Words were still like marbles in her throat, but she reached under her pillow and pulled out another drawing. This one had Beacon in a field of daisies, eyes closed peacefully. Back at the shelter, Beacon lay curled in the far corner of his kennel tail, occasionally flicking against the ground. In the adjacent office, Clara prepared a formal report, her handwriting meticulous. Observation summary. Day 4. Subject. Beacon has ceased all signs of hyperreactivity in presence of child subject. Ellie Hayes displays signs of selective engagement, voluntary calm and emerging attachment behavior. Eka hypothesis. Early-stage emotional imprinting catalyzed by mutual unspoken trauma. But what Clara left out of her report was the most telling thing of all. The way Beacon had begun to sleep. Not in tight guarded curls, not with one ear twitching toward every sound, but loose, vulnerable. As if, for the first time in a long time, he wasn't listening for ghosts. It had been raining steadily over Asheville for 2 days, soaking the red clay roads and turning the gravel path to Haven Ridge Rescue Center into a mire of soft sludge. The hills that usually blushed gold at sunset were hidden beneath layers of gray mist. The center, once humming quietly with routine, now held a tension like storm clouds before a thunderclap. The disruption came on a Wednesday morning disguised as a man in a windbreaker and well-polished shoes. Trent Davison, an investigative reporter for the Southeast Watchdog known more for stirring controversies than exposing truths, arrived without an appointment wielding a camera crew and an agenda. Trent was a man in his late 30s with a square jaw, sharp cheekbones and dark blue eyes that always looked 2 seconds away from a smirk. His brown hair was combed back with almost too much care, and his presence had the quiet aggression of a man who believed he already had the truth. He stood just outside the fenced yard, eyes narrowed on a small girl, seated near a kennel. Inside lay Beacon, the infamous golden retriever, watching her with ears perked and body still. The little girl was Ellie Hayes, 6 years old, soft brown curls tucked behind her ears, her face pale with silence and focus. Trent snapped a photo. That evening the article went live. Children used in dangerous canine conditioning. Inside the troubling practices at Haven Ridge, the headline was bold, the subtext sharper. The piece painted the center as reckless, implying that Ellie, still grieving and mute after her father's death, was being exploited to tame an unstable dog flagged for aggression. Trent's tone danced between concern and condemnation, but the message was clear. Haven Ridge had crossed a line. The public's reaction was swift. Comments flooded in. Some were concerned, some furious. A few demanded an investigation. Parents questioned the safety protocols. Donors reached out to the board. News stations picked up the story and replayed the image of Ellie near Beacon over and over, as if to prove the narrative. Rachel Hayes, Ellie's mother, and the center's director sat in a cold meeting room the next day with the board of trustees. Her hands were folded tightly in her lap. She hadn't slept since the article broke. Across from her, the chairwoman of the board, Susan Fielding, a woman in her 60s with a controlled voice and a background in nonprofit management, read the headlines aloud once more, as if repetition might summon a better solution. "We need to act," Susan said. "We cannot afford to let this escalate. The optics are bad. We are being framed as endangering children. Your child. Rachel, for the sake of rehabilitating a dog no one else would take." Rachel remained calm, but her voice was firm. "Beacon is not dangerous. He has only shown progress, especially around Ellie. She's the first one he's connected with." Susan looked at the others in the room. "That may be true, but perception outweighs reality in matters of public trust. And right now, perception is that we're using a child to train a dangerous animal. That's not a position we can defend." There was a pause. Then came the line Rachel had dreaded. "We think it's time Beacon was removed from the program." The decision, they insisted, wasn't about punishment. It was about minimizing risk, about protecting the center, about protecting Ellie. Rachel sat still. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't argue, but her fingers trembled slightly as she folded the meeting notes and left the room in silence. In the kennel, Beacon sensed something had changed. The air was heavier. People passed more quickly by his gate. The warmth of Ellie's daily visits had not returned that day. He whined softly as the sky grew darker outside. The days following the controversy were heavy with silence. Not the tense kind that fills rooms after arguments, but the kind that falls gently like snow, muting the chaos of the outside world. It had been 1 week since Rachel Hayes had stood in the director's office of Haven Creek Rescue Center and asked for something no one else dared to. 2 more weeks, just 214 days, to prove that what she and Ellie had begun with Beacon wasn't an accident. It was healing. It was sacred. Rachel, a woman of quiet strength and unshakable grief, had once taught high school literature. But since her husband's death overseas and Ellie's subsequent silence, she'd abandoned lesson plans for therapy appointments, parent forums, and empty notebooks filled with half-hearted coping strategies. Now, all her attention turned to a golden retriever with a scarred flank and guarded eyes. Beacon was her daughter's mirror. Fractured, but not broken. During those 14 days, Haven Creek placed Beacon under constant supervision, but gave Ellie space to interact within view. Rachel monitored every moment. She brought blankets, snacks, and sketchbooks to the open pen where Beacon was kept. There were no leashes, no demands, just stillness and time. The most remarkable thing was that Beacon, previously volatile with even the most patient staff, never growled when Ellie came close. He didn't flinch when she sat near. He didn't bark when she moved suddenly. In fact, he began to shift his posture the moment she arrived, ears forward, tail low, but no longer tucked. Ellie, in her own way, responded too. The girl, who hadn't spoken in months now, whispered softly, not in English, in Dutch. "Zit," she said once, sitting down herself on the grass. Beacon blinked, confused. "Zit," she repeated, pointing to the ground beside her. Beacon sat. Rachel gasped, but said nothing. Each day, Ellie brought a new word. Blythe, stay vogue. Follow lig, lie down. Each time, Beacon obeyed, not with the robotic precision of training, but with slow recognition, as if unlocking a memory. There was no snap to attention, no show of force, just a mutual trust being rewritten with every breath. Beacon had once served in active duty, though most of his files were redacted or missing. What remained suggested trauma, aggression, and an incident overseas that left him untouchable. But here in the soft cradle of Ellie's presence, something different emerged. Not obedience. Bond. On the 9th day, Rachel noticed something peculiar. Ellie no longer needed to speak. She had begun crafting gestures, gentle movements of her hands, a tilt of her chin, a look. Beacon responded to them as if the girl were writing music in the air. When she touched her wrist, he laid down. When she tapped her fingers against her thigh, he followed. It wasn't training. It was translation. At night, Rachel stayed late in the observation booth watching the footage. She saw Beacon curl beside Ellie, eyes closed but body alert. She saw the girl place a hand on his back and draw slow circles with her thumb. Once, Rachel saw Ellie lean forward and rest her forehead against Beacon's. Neither moved for 5 full minutes. Rachel wept alone. By the 12th day it was clear, even to the center's senior caretakers, Beacon was changing. No aggression, no escape attempts, no snapping, only presence, only patience. Ellie, too, was different. Though still mostly silent with others, her eyes now followed people when they entered rooms. She no longer clung to her mother's leg. Once she laughed softly when Beacon chased a falling leaf across the yard. Rachel almost didn't believe what she heard. Each word she whispered was a resurrection. Each look they shared was a prayer answered. On the final morning of the 2-week trial, Rachel found Ellie already awake. The little girl was standing by the window in her pajamas, sketchbook in hand, drawing Beacon again. This time, not as a dog behind bars, but with wings lifting above a broken fence. They walked to the rescue center together. The air was crisp and bright. In the yard, Beacon waited. Rachel opened the gate and Ellie ran in. Beacon trotted to her and sat down, waiting. "Lig," Ellie whispered. He lay beside her without hesitation. The town of Brook Hollow had a strange stillness to it. That afternoon, one that Rachel Hayes noticed but dismissed too, caught up in sorting through the paperwork for Beacon's evaluation. The sky had taken on a muted gray, the kind of hue that whispered snow before it shouted, and when it shouted it screamed. Rachel, a woman in her early 30s with shoulder-length honey-blonde hair, often tied in a loose bun, was usually calm even in chaos. Her tall, lean frame moved with purpose. Her hazel eyes always alert, especially since she lost her husband, a firefighter who died during a wildfire operation. That loss had carved a quiet sorrow into her features, one that only Ellie seemed to recognize. And in Ellie's silence, Rachel found both the deepest wound and her most profound hope. The school had let out early due to the coming storm. Rachel was supposed to pick up Ellie at 2:30, but the time now read 2:52, and her phone had 2 missed calls from the school. A sick panic crept into her chest. She grabbed her coat, shouted for Beacon, and ran. Beacon, now just over 7 years old, had transformed. His once feral glances had softened whenever Ellie was near. His golden fur shimmered with health, and though his right ear bore an old scar from his service days, he now moved with a grounded calm, until Rachel's voice cracked in alarm. That voice, that urgency, was familiar to the part of him that once responded to danger like it was a calling. They drove through snow that began as flurries and had become walls of white. Visibility was poor. Roads, slick tires protested every turn. At the school, Rachel found nothing. Ellie hadn't gotten on the bus. No one had seen where she went. Her coat was missing from the cubby. Her gloves gone. Rachel knew her daughter. Ellie hated the noise of dismissal time. She must have wandered, and now, with snow piling up, like the world was bearing itself, she was out there alone. The search began on foot. Rachel's breath came in quick clouds, tears turning to ice. Beacon trotted beside her alert. "Find her," Rachel whispered, voice shaking. She didn't know if he would understand, but Beacon lowered his snout to the ground, sniffed once and took off. They passed the field near the woods, Beacon circling tail, stiff his eyes scanning. Then he halted, nose high. He started running. Not the panicked kind of run, but precise, focused, like something in him had clicked into place. Rachel stumbled to follow. A half-mile west through bramble and shadowed pine stood the old Jacobson barn, unused since the owner died last spring. The door hung loose, snow curling into its mouth like a tongue. Beacon barked once sharply, then pressed inside. Rachel followed. Ellie sat against the far wall, her tiny frame shivering beneath her damp purple coat. Her cheeks were pale lips, blue. She held her stuffed fox close, its seams darkened with melted snow. She looked up when Beacon entered. No scream, no panic, just relief. Her fingers, barely mobile, reached out to touch the dog's warm chest. Beacon lay down beside her without hesitation. His thick body curled protectively around her, and Rachel swore she saw his body rise and fall with exaggerated calm, as though he meant to show Ellie how to breathe. Rachel ran in, dropping beside them. She checked her daughter's pulse, whispered softly, wrapped her in the emergency blanket she always kept in the car. But it was Beacon's warmth that made the difference. Without him, Ellie would have succumbed to the cold within another hour. The snowstorm howled louder outside, but in the barn it was quiet. Rachel called for help on her phone signal, barely strong enough, and waited with her child and the dog that everyone once feared, her arms wrapped around both. Later, when the paramedics arrived and brought Ellie back to warmth and safety, one of them, a young man named Luis Alvarez, with kind brown eyes and a firefighter's quiet steadiness, whistled at Beacon and said, "This guy's more hero than most people I know." Rachel didn't reply. She just looked at Beacon, who now rested with his head on Ellie's lap as the ambulance rolled down the icy path. For once, the dog looked at peace. Not like a weapon waiting to be triggered, but like a guardian who had fulfilled his vow. The snow outside had thinned into scattered flurries by the time Ellie woke up in the pediatric recovery wing of Brook Hollow Regional Hospital. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic and oranges. Someone had left a peeled one on the tray table beside her bed. Her eyelids fluttered, and her lips moved before Rachel could say a word. "Where's Beacon?" Rachel, seated by her daughter's bedside with her hands clenched tight in her lap, didn't respond immediately. Tears burned at the corner of her eyes, not from fear this time, but from awe. For nearly a year, Ellie's world had been one of silence. Now her first concern was not herself, but the dog who had kept her warm through the storm. Nurses moved gently around them, and one of them, a short woman named Camille Jones, with tight black curls and warm brown skin, gave Rachel a nod. "She's good," Camille whispered. "Vitals are stable." And she asked about him. "That matters." Rachel smiled through her tears. He saved her. But outside the hospital walls, controversy was mounting. Back at the shelter, the board of directors had convened. Leading them was Arthur Mallory, a stout man in his late 60s with graying temples, a penchant for bow ties, and an unshakable belief in protocols Mallory was known for, quoting bylaws like scripture. "The fact remains," he said sternly to the gathered staff, "Beacon was removed from the premises without authorization. Regardless of the outcome, that is a breach." Sitting across from him was Dr. Clara Whitmore. Clara's usually steady demeanor betrayed frustration. Mallory, the dog, didn't just wander out, he saved a child. Surely that deserves a pause in procedure. He's a liability. Mallory shot back. One act of heroism doesn't erase years of dangerous behavior. The room quieted as the door opened and someone unexpected stepped in, tall and lean, dressed in an old olive-green field jacket dusted with snow. The man walked with the kind of posture only years of service instill. His short salt-and-pepper hair framed a deeply lined face, and his left leg carried a slight but noticeable limp. "I'm Dean Rivers," he said, voice graveled from cold and time I trained Beacon. "And I've got something to say." Dean was in his late 50s, a former K-9 handler from the U.S. Army, who had retired quietly to a nearby town. Most didn't know he was still around living off the grid with a rescued hawk and a garden of tomatoes. He tended like therapy. When he'd seen the news about Beacon's supposed misconduct and the shelter's consideration of euthanasia, he'd made the decision to come forward. Beacon isn't dangerous, Dean began. He's loyal. Too loyal. Maybe that's what got him discharged. He unfolded the story like a worn letter. Years ago, Beacon had served overseas in a classified operation. His handler at the time had been a man named Captain Darren Hayes, Rachel's late husband. The mission had gone wrong. A roadside bomb and ambush Beacon had defied in order to retreat, and instead dragged Darren nearly 60 yards through gunfire to a medic. Darren died a week later, but only because his injuries were beyond saving. Beacon never recovered from the loss. Dean's voice cracked. He waited outside the medical tent for 3 days, wouldn't eat, wouldn't move. He had to be sedated before they could transfer him out. Arthur Mallory rubbed his chin but said nothing. Dr. Whitmore added gently, that was when he started resisting commands, snapping, but never without cause. Dean nodded. He recognized grief. That girl, Ellie, she carries the same scent, the same weight and Beacon. He remembers Rachel, who had arrived midway through the testimony, stood silently at the back of the room. She clutched a folder full of behavioral records and Ellie's artwork, but none of it mattered more than what Dean had said. Beacon's aggression wasn't randomness. It was heartbreak. The vote was held 2 hours later. Narrowly, the board decided not to euthanize Beacon, but he would be reassigned, unless further behavioral proof was submitted within the next month. Rachel requested that he be temporarily released into her supervised care. I'm a trained counselor. My house is fenced, and I have someone who needs him, she said. Mallory hesitated, then nodded. 30 days. And if there's a single incident, there won't be, Rachel said. That night as snow settled gently over the rooftops of Brook Hollow, Rachel brought Beacon to the hospital parking lot. Ellie, watching from the window, lit up like someone had flipped a switch inside her. She pressed her palm to the glass. Beacon, though still sore from the cold, and the commotion, lifted his head proudly. They had found each other again. Spring arrived early in Eagle Glen that year. Snow gave way to soft rains and wet sidewalks lined with blooming dogwoods. The air carried the scent of thawed soil and daffodils, and the small town seemed to exhale after a winter that had tested everyone's strength. The Hayes household, tucked into the curve of a quiet cul-de-sac, had changed too. It had been a full month since the storm. Beacon now lay sprawled across an old braided rug in the living room, golden fur catching the morning light like woven threads of fire. He was no longer the dog no one dared touch, no longer the misunderstood shadow behind shelter bars. He had become something else entirely. Family. Rachel Hayes, a woman once worn thin by grief and single motherhood, now moved through her home with a quiet steadiness. She was tall, with ash-blonde hair. She often pulled into a messy bun, and soft lines under her eyes that came from both worry and resilience. A licensed trauma counselor by profession, she'd spent the last few weeks transitioning her practice to home sessions so she could remain close to Ellie and Beacon. Her warmth was not the flamboyant kind. It was quiet, patient, and built in layers like a quilt passed down through generations. Ellie, now 6.5, had transformed in ways no one could have predicted. The silence that once enveloped her had faded like fog under the sun. Though still shy in public at home, she chattered gently, mostly to Beacon, her voice small but confident. She'd even returned to kindergarten part-time, her teachers reporting that she laughed when books were read aloud and had begun drawing pictures of a dog and a star over and over again. In her words, the dog is Beacon, and the star is where Daddy watches us. Each night, Ellie read to Beacon from the same book, The Tale of the North Wind, a children's story about a wolf who finds a lost moonbeam and carries it home. Beacon would lie beside her bed, one ear, twitching eyes half closed, but never fully asleep until her voice stopped. Dr. Clara. Whitmore, despite being semi-retired, continued visiting once a week for behavioral check-ins. She'd insisted on it, and, truthfully, no one had argued. She arrived one Friday morning in her signature burgundy trench coat, a steaming travel mug in hand, her graying hair braided down her back. She watched Beacon trot over, sit, and gently rest his head on Ellie's lap as the girl hummed a lullaby from her picture book. "You know what? I think," Rachel Clara said softly, "I think this dog isn't just rehabilitated. He's reborn." Beacon's story, however, had not remained just theirs for long. Trent Davison, the same reporter who had once tried to shut the shelter down, returned to Hollow Creek Center this time, not with accusations, but with a camera crew. He had been following the viral spread of Ellie and Beacon's recovery. A video Rachel had uploaded of Ellie whispering a command in Dutch, and Beacon responding instantly had garnered nearly 5 million views in 2 days. It was clipped, remixed, and captioned in multiple languages. Proof that healing speaks no language but love. Trent, a man with slicked-back dark hair and a sharp navy blazer, stood humbly before the center's director board. "I was wrong," he said simply. "The world needs this story now more than ever." It was this momentum that sparked the transformation. The outdoor training grounds at Hollow Creek, a dusty trail once used for routine drills, were soon renovated. A new gate was installed, a mural painted along the inner wall, showing Ellie holding Beacon's leash beneath a glowing constellation sky. The trail was renamed Beacon's Path, a tribute to the dog who had found not just a child in the snow, but a town's lost spirit. The mural was painted by a young artist named Lily Monroe, a part-time volunteer and former street graffiti painter who had turned her life around after her own encounter with therapy animals. Lily was petite, with wild curls, dyed honey blonde and faded tattoos running down her arms. She rarely spoke unless asked, but when she painted she told stories no one could ignore. When asked why she volunteered for the mural, she simply said, "Someone like me needs to remember dogs like him exist." Rachel, watching the final brushstrokes from a folding chair beside Clara and Dean Rivers, felt something stir inside her, a release. Dean had stayed in touch too, checking in with Beacon like a proud old general visiting his finest soldier. He still limped slightly and refused to carry a smartphone, but he carried Beacon's first collar on his keychain now. "A soldier's never truly retired," he had said with a wink. And so, as the last light of day slanted across the shelter yard and onto Beacon's Path, a new chapter began, not just for a dog, not just for a little girl, but for anyone who had ever been told they were too broken to heal. Beacon trotted up the trail with Ellie beside him, her small hand on his back, and Rachel just behind them. They didn't need a crowd. The story had already been written across the town's heart. The dog who once trembled in cages now stood under sunlight surrounded by laughter, soft hands, and a child who had found her voice. Sometimes the ones the world casts aside are the very ones chosen to bring healing. Beacon was not just a rescue dog. He was an answered prayer wrapped in golden fur. Through the silent bond with a grieving child, through snowstorms and trials, he reminded us that love can speak without words, and that miracles often arrive in the most unexpected forms. Perhaps God sends us signs not as thunderous voices, but in quiet moments, a child's laughter, returning a dog resting its head in trust, a path once broken, now walked in peace. When we open our hearts to compassion, even shattered things can be made whole again. So if this story touched you, share it with someone who might need hope today. Comment below if you've ever witnessed a small miracle in your own life. Subscribe to our channel to follow more stories where love and faith overcome fear. And if you believe that healing can begin in the most unlikely places, write Amen in the comments. And may God bless and protect you and your family always.